Right now, somewhere on Earth, one man is making $100,000 every single minute. Not from working, not from building rockets or sending tweets, just from existing, just from owning things. This month, the world got its first trillionaire. His name is Elon Musk. He used to be my role model many years ago, and I talked about him a lot during my job and scholarship interviews. A lot. And if you were my friend or if you have interviewed me before, you have seen me talking about Elon Musk as my role model. And before you scroll past this as just another rich guy headline, I need you to understand what $1 trillion actually means. Because I promise you, your brain cannot currently comprehend it. So here's the question that actually matters. Not how did he get rich, the question is what happens to the rest of us when one person owns this much and this fast. Because this isn't really a story about Elon Musk, it is a preview of where wealth and power are heading in the next decade and who gets left out when they get there. Hi, I'm Sirat, a lawyer turned cybersecurity specialist. With a background in law and tech, I analyze how technology, cybersecurity, and geopolitics collide to shape global power. And Musk's becoming the first trillionaire is exactly where all three of those forces meet at once. Let's just start with the number itself, because most people, including me, until I really sat down with it, have no real grip on how large a trillion is. We have always struggled to explain the gap between a million and a billion. A million minutes ago was less than 2 years ago. A billion minutes ago, you are back in the Roman Empire. That's the kind of gap we are talking about between comfortable and billionaire. Now, stretch that to a trillion. A trillion minutes ago, modern humans didn't even fully evolve. So minutes stopped being useful. Let's go to the seconds instead. A million seconds is about 11 days. A billion seconds is 32 years. A trillion seconds is 32,000 years. A trillion isn't just a lot of money. It's a number that breaks the human brain's ability to scale. Here is a clear way to feel it. If you take $1 billion and just let it sit in an account earning a modest 5% a year, you would be paid roughly $1 million a week, doing nothing. Now scale that to a trillion. That is $50 billion a year, $1 billion a week, or broken down further, $137 million a day, $5.7 million an hour, roughly $100,000 a minute, about $1,600 a second. That is the passive income $1 trillion generates. Musk doesn't have to build anything, launch anything, or post anything for that number to keep climbing. It climbs while he sleeps. Here is where this stops being a curiosity and it starts being a geopolitical and economic warning sign. First, this $1 trillion isn't sitting in a bank account. It is not cash, it's ownership. Musk's wealth comes from stakes in Tesla, in X, and critically in SpaceX, the company that just had its satellite arm valued at around $2 trillion on private markets, with Musk holding roughly half of it. And that distinction, cash versus ownership, is exactly why people are misreading how dangerous this is. Owning a pile of cash is one thing. Owning the physical infrastructure that governments, militaries, and economies actually depend on is something else entirely. Satellite networks used for weather forecasting, communications, defense systems. When the asset you own is the thing every government on Earth eventually needs, you don't just have wealth, you have leverage over sovereign states. Second, notice how fast this happened. Musk didn't suddenly become a trillionaire last week. He had probably crossed that threshold months earlier. We only found out because he sold a small slice of his SpaceX shares, which forced the market to finally put a public number on a company that had never been priced before. In other words, he was already a trillionaire. We just weren't watching closely enough to know it. That should genuinely unsettle you. If a number this enormous can sit unmeasured and unnoticed for months, it tells you something uncomfortable. As a society, we have almost completely stopped tracking how fast extreme wealth is actually accumulating at the very top. Now let's zoom out, because the speed of this is the real story. Let me know your thoughts on this. Please share it in the comments below after liking this video. 6 years ago, when economic commentators were sounding the alarm about emergency government spending during the pandemic, the headline figure being thrown around as almost unimaginable was around £300 billion. At that time, that figure was over 3 times the entire net worth of the world's richest man. Today, that same £300 billion is less than a third of the wealth of the world's richest man. In 6 years, we went from this huge government number is triple the richest man's fortune to the richest man's fortune is triple this huge government number. Does that make sense? That is roughly a 9 times swing in relative scale in 6 years. That is not gradual change, that is exponential compounding, visible in real time. And this is the part people miss. This isn't really about Musk as an individual, it's about what unrestrained compound growth does once it reaches critical mass. $1 trillion generating $137 million a day doesn't need strategy or genius to keep growing. At that scale, wealth behaves less like a bank balance and more like it owns physical force. It pulls in everything around it. Think of it less as a person and more as a black hole sitting inside the global economy, a gravitational center that cannot help but draw in every nearby asset. And when that gravitational pull is strong enough, it doesn't just buy yachts and rockets, it buys the assets ordinary people depend on. Housing, university places, healthcare access, water rights, tied to the data centers now being built to train artificial intelligence systems, something that these rich people really need to go on. When the ultra-wealth expand their consumption, they are not adding to the economy in a neutral way, they are competing directly with you for the same finite resources. And they have functionally unlimited purchasing power to win that competition every time when compared to you. This is why the ownership of media and political influence tends to cluster around this class almost as a side effect, not a conspiracy. Musk owns X. Jeff Bezos owns The Washington Post. When the daily passive income is measured in the tens of millions, buying influence isn't even a meaningful expense. It is a rounding error. Here's the turning point, and it is the part most coverage of this story completely missed. This isn't the first time in history we have watched a concentration of wealth and power grow this fast, this visibly, while most of the world shrugged. Go back to the colonial and early industrial era in Europe. Wealth accumulated in European ants at a pace the rest of the world initially dismissed as irrelevant to them. China, sitting on centuries of economic and technological dominance, largely ignored the early signs. The thinking was simple. Why would rapid wealth growth on the other side of the world matter here to me? Then European industrial output became so efficient it could undercut local producers anywhere on Earth. And when those local economies tried to protect themselves by refusing to trade on those terms, they were met with force. The result for China specifically was a period historians now describe as a century of humiliation, a direct consequence of underestimating how fast concentrated economic power can convert into geopolitical power. That story matters right now because we are watching the same pattern with new set of actors. Today, it is not empires, it's individuals and a handful of companies they control, racing ahead in space infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and the compute and energy systems underneath them. The instinct to think this doesn't affect me yet is the exact same instinct that cost entire nations a century of relative decline. So when you watch Musk's $1 trillion climb, the honest geopolitical read isn't envy, it's recognition. You are watching a private actor accumulating the kind of leverage that used to require controlling an army or a colony. Except now it comes through owning the rockets, satellites, and data infrastructure that states themselves increasingly cannot function without. So where does this actually leave us? There are really only two paths from here. Either extreme, largely untaxed concentration of wealth and infrastructure ownership continues unchecked, in which case ordinary households are gradually priced out of housing, education, and even water security. The way history shows us happens when this pattern runs its course. Or governments, including here in Europe, start treating extreme wealth concentration as the structural and security issue it actually is. Not just a fairness debate, but a question of who ultimately controls the infrastructure modern states depend on. This isn't a left versus right argument, and it isn't really an American story either. Even though Musk is the headline, it's a question every government watching satellite, constellation, AI compute, and critical infrastructure increasingly concentrated in a handful of private hands needs to answer. And soon, do we regulate this kind of a structural privilege now, while there is still real competition for it? Or do we wait until there genuinely isn't? That is the real story behind the world's first trillionaire. Not the number, what the number is quietly buying. We really need to talk about such issues in our school, university, podcasts, and daily life. What do you think about this? If this kind of analysis is useful to you, subscribe, because we track exactly this intersection every week where technology, infrastructure, and power collide. And I want to know, what do you think? Should government treat extreme infrastructure ownership like this as a national security question? Drop your take in the comments. I read all of them and respond with my own little understanding of the matter. See you in the next video. Bye.